The afternoon sun beat down on the windshield as 16-year-old Chiana sat quietly in the passenger seat, her stomach tight with worry. Something wasn't right. Her mother's boyfriend had picked her up from school, saying they needed to make a quick stop before heading home. But that was 2 hours ago, and they were now driving on a highway she didn't recognize. Chiana glanced at her phone. No signal. She looked over at the man driving, someone her mother had only been dating for a few months. His face was hard, his jaw clenched tight as he stared straight ahead. This wasn't the same friendly guy who had been coming around for Sunday dinners. Today, there was something cold in his eyes. "Where are we going?" Chiana asked again, trying to keep her voice steady. "Told you already. Got to pick something up for your mom," he said without looking at her. "Put your phone away. Battery's probably dying anyway with no signal out here." Chiana slipped her phone into her pocket, not wanting to upset him. She'd been texting her mom earlier, but the messages weren't going through. The car slowed as they approached a small town, and Chiana felt a flicker of hope when they'd pulled up to a traffic light. There were people here. Other cars. In the car next to them sat a broad-shouldered man in a green t-shirt. He was tapping his fingers on the steering wheel, waiting for the light to change. Chiana's mind raced as she remembered a video her friend had shown her a few weeks back. It was about a hand signal that meant someone needed help, a way to silently say "rescue me" without anyone else knowing. Her heart hammered in her chest as she slowly raised her hand, palm facing outward toward the window. She tucked her thumb into her palm, then folded her fingers down, trapping her thumb inside. The signal was subtle, but clear to anyone who knew what it meant. The man in the next car didn't notice at first. His eyes were on the road ahead. Chiana felt panic rising. The light would change soon. This might be her only chance to get help. She made the gesture again, more deliberately this time, her eyes wide with fear. "What are you doing with your hand?" Her mother's boyfriend snapped, reaching over to grab her wrist. "Keep your hands down. Don't be drawing attention." Chiana quickly pulled her arm back, heart racing. "Just stretching my fingers," she said. "They're cramping from holding my phone." He grunted, not fully convinced. The moment his eyes returned to the road, Chiana risked one more desperate attempt, making the hand signal a final time. This time, the man in the next car saw her. His eyes narrowed slightly, then widened with recognition. He gave a tiny nod, so small she almost missed it. Then he looked away, as if nothing had happened. The light turned green. Chiana's stomach dropped as their car started moving again. Had the man really understood? Would he do anything? Or had she imagined that look of recognition? As they drove through the intersection, Chiana noticed the green car wasn't turning off or continuing straight. It was following them, keeping a few car lengths back. Not obvious enough for her mother's boyfriend to notice in his mirrors, but definitely there. A tiny spark of hope flickered inside her. Someone had seen her. Someone who recognized a cry for help. For the first time since this terrifying drive began, Chiana allowed herself to believe she might find a way out of whatever was happening. But they were still heading away from home, towards some unknown destination, and her mother's boyfriend was growing more agitated by the minute, constantly checking his mirrors and gripping the steering wheel so tight his knuckles turned white. Whatever was about to happen, Chiana knew things would get worse before they got better. She took a deep breath and prepared herself for what might come next. Staff Sergeant Ray Wilson was having a pretty normal Sunday. He'd spent the weekend with his parents and younger sister, sharing meals and catching up on family news. Now he was heading back to base, his duffel bag tossed in the back seat and country music playing softly on the radio. The familiar weight of responsibility settled back on his shoulders as he got closer to returning to duty. Ray had been in the Marines for 12 years now. 2 tours overseas had taught him to notice things others might miss, small details that didn't quite fit. His buddies always joked about his eagle eyes, but Ray just called it staying alive. That habit of watching and noticing hadn't turned off when he came home. Stopped at the red light, Ray drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, mentally running through his schedule for the week. Training exercises on Tuesday, paperwork due Wednesday, and a meeting with the new recruits Thursday morning. His mind was half on the road, half on work, when something caught his attention. In the car next to him, a teenage girl was looking directly at him, a hand raised against the window. At first, he thought she might be waving, but then he recognized the gesture, palm out, thumb tucked in, fingers closing over it. His body tensed immediately. Just last month, the entire unit had gone through a training session about recognizing signs of human trafficking and domestic abuse. That hand signal was one of the key things they'd learned, a silent call for help. Ray kept his face neutral, giving only the slightest nod to show he'd seen her. His eyes flicked to the driver, a man in his 40s, constantly checking his mirrors, one hand gripping the steering wheel while the other kept reaching toward the girl whenever she moved. Classic controlling behavior. The light turned green. Ray let the other car pull ahead slightly, then followed at a careful distance. His mind ran through the possibilities. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe they just had an argument. But something in the girl's eyes told him this was serious. She was scared, really scared. He picked up his phone and called 911, keeping his voice low and calm. "I need to report a possible abduction situation," he told the dispatcher. "I'm following a blue sedan, license plate TRK 429. Driver is male, around 40. Passenger is a black teenage girl who just gave me the domestic violence hand signal at a traffic light." The dispatcher asked for his location, which Ray provided, along with the direction they were heading. "Sir, are you still following the vehicle?" the dispatcher asked. "Yes, ma'am. I'm keeping my distance." "They don't know I'm behind them," Ray replied. "I'm a Marine stationed at Fort Greene. I've had training in recognizing trafficking situations." "Police units are being dispatched now," the dispatcher assured him. "Can you safely continue to follow and update location?" "Affirmative," Ray said, using his military habits without thinking. "Wait, they're turning onto County Road 16. That's heading out of town, not much out there except old farm roads." Ray's concern deepened. If this man was taking the girl to a secondary location, the situation was likely worse than he initially thought. He'd learned in training that when potential traffickers move victims to isolated areas, the danger escalates dramatically. The car had suddenly sped up. Ray's grip tightened on the steering wheel as he maintained his distance. Had the driver spotted him? Was he getting suspicious? Ray took a deep breath, keeping his emotions in check. The girl had reached out for help, and he wasn't about to let her down. He'd seen too much overseas to walk away from someone in danger. Whatever happened next, he was committed now. "They're increasing speed," he told the dispatcher. "I think the driver might be getting suspicious." The blue sedan was now speeding down the rural road, dust kicking up behind it. Ray followed, keeping the car in sight while watching for any sign of police backup. He hoped they would arrive soon, but until then, he was the only one standing between that girl and whatever terrible plans the driver had in mind. Ray kept a steady distance behind the blue sedan, his hands firm on the wheel. The road stretched out ahead, cutting through farmland and patches of trees. Few other cars passed by. This was exactly the kind of isolated area where bad things happened. "I'm still following them on County Road 16, Ray updated the dispatcher, his phone on speaker now. "We're about 7 miles outside of town. Any word on how close police units are?" "Units are en route. Estimated arrival in your area is 8 minutes, the dispatcher replied. "Can you still see the vehicle?" "Yes, I have visual." "They're moving fast, probably 10 over the speed limit." Ray squinted at the car ahead. "The driver is getting more erratic. Keeps swerving a bit, like he's arguing with the passenger." Inside that car, Ray knew the girl must be terrified. He thought about his own little sister back home, how he'd do anything to protect her. This wasn't just about Judy anymore. This was personal. The road ahead curved sharply to the right. As the blue sedan took the turn, Ray noticed the brake lights flash several times, as if the driver was tapping the pedal nervously. Something was happening inside that car. "Dispatcher, I think there's a struggle going on inside the vehicle," Ray said, his voice tense but controlled. "The car is braking erratically." Ray's training kicked in automatically. He mentally ran through possible scenarios. If the car stopped suddenly, what would he do? If the driver tried to run, how would he respond? If the girl was in immediate danger, could he intervene safely before police arrived? The dispatcher's voice cracked through the speaker. "Sir, police advise you to maintain your distance. Do not approach the vehicle if it stops. Officer Wilson is 2 minutes out from your location, coming from the north." "Copy that," Ray acknowledged, though every instinct told him to close the distance. Suddenly, the blue sedan veered sharply, dust billowing as it partially left the road. Ray's heart jumped into his throat. He slowed his own vehicle, maintaining distance while keeping them in sight. "They've pulled halfway off the road," he reported. "Can't tell if it was intentional or if something happened inside." The next few seconds seemed to stretch into minutes as Ray watched the scene unfold. The car door flew open on the passenger side. The teenage girl burst out, stumbling as her feet hit the gravel shoulder. The driver's door opened a moment later, the man lunging out after her. "She's out of the car," Ray told the dispatcher, already pulling over. "She's running from the vehicle. The man is chasing her. I'm stopping now." Ray didn't wait for a response. He pulled his car onto the shoulder about 50 yards behind the blue sedan, threw it into park, and jumped out. The girl was running across an open field beside the road, the man gaining on her. Ray sprinted after them, closing the distance quickly. His military boots pounded against the dirt, his lungs burning as he pushed himself harder. The man had almost reached the girl, his hand stretching out to grab her. "U.S. Marines? Stop right there!" Ray shouted, his voice carrying across the field with the authority of someone used to being obeyed. The man hesitated just long enough for the girl to pull away from his grasp. He turned, seeing Ray for the first time. The look that crossed the man's face was one Ray had seen before, the panicked calculation of someone realizing they'd been caught. Ray slowed to a stop about 10 feet from the man, positioning himself between him and the girl. He stood tall, shoulders squared, hands loose at his sides but ready to move. He didn't have a weapon, but he had training and size on his side. "Back away from her," Ray commanded, his voice steady. "Police are already on their way." The girl had stopped running and stood frozen, breathing hard, tears streaming down her face. Ray could hear the faint wail of sirens in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. The man took a step backward, eyes darting from Ray to the road and back again. "This isn't your business," he snarled. "This is a family matter." "She used the signal," Ray replied simply. "That made it my business." The standoff stretched between them, tension thick in the air. Ray knew the next few moments would determine everything. Help was coming, but it wasn't here yet. Until then, he was the only thing standing between this girl and whatever horrible fate had been planned for her. Ray kept a steady distance behind the blue sedan, his hands firm on the wheel. The road stretched out ahead, cutting through farmland and patches of trees. Few other cars passed by. This was exactly the kind of isolated area where bad things happened. "I'm still following them on County Road 16, Ray updated the dispatcher, his phone on speaker now. "We're about 7 miles outside of town. Any word on how close police units are?" "Units are en route. Estimated arrival in your area is 8 minutes, the dispatcher replied. "Can you still see the vehicle?" "Yes, I have visual." "They're moving fast, probably 10 over the speed limit." Ray squinted at the car ahead. "The driver is getting more erratic, keeps swerving a bit, like he's arguing with the passenger." Inside that car, Ray knew the girl must be terrified. He thought about his own little sister back home, how he'd do anything to protect her. This wasn't just about Judy anymore. This was personal. The road ahead curved sharply to the right. As the blue sedan took the turn, Ray noticed the brake lights flash several times, as if the driver was tapping the pedal nervously. Something was happening inside that car. "Dispatcher, I think there's a struggle going on inside the vehicle," Ray said, his voice tense but controlled. "The car is braking erratically." Ray's training kicked in automatically. He mentally ran through possible scenarios. If the car stopped suddenly, what would he do? If the driver tried to run, how would he respond? If the girl was in immediate danger, could he intervene safely before police arrived? The dispatcher's voice cracked through the speaker. "Sir, police advise you to maintain your distance. Do not approach the vehicle if it stops. Officer Wilson is 2 minutes out from your location, coming from the north." "Copy that," Ray acknowledged, though every instinct told him to close the distance. Suddenly, the blue sedan veered sharply, dust billowing as it partially left the road. Ray's heart jumped into his throat. He slowed his own vehicle, maintaining distance while keeping them in sight. "They've pulled halfway off the road," he reported. "Can't tell if it was intentional or if something happened inside." The next few seconds seemed to stretch into minutes as Ray watched the scene unfold. The car door flew open on the passenger side. The teenage girl burst out, stumbling as her feet hit the gravel shoulder. The driver's door opened a moment later, the man lunging out after her. "She's out of the car," Ray told the dispatcher, already pulling over. "She's running from the vehicle. The man is chasing her." "I'm stopping now." Ray didn't wait for a response. He pulled his car onto the shoulder about 50 yards behind the blue sedan, threw it into park, and jumped out. The girl was running across an open field beside the road, the man gaining on her. Ray sprinted after them, closing the distance quickly. His military boots pounded against the dirt, his lungs burning as he pushed himself harder. The man had almost reached the girl, his hand stretching out to grab her. "U.S. Marines? Stop right there!" Ray shouted, his voice carrying across the field with the authority of someone used to being obeyed. The man hesitated just long enough for the girl to pull away from his grasp. He turned, seeing Ray for the first time. The look that crossed the man's face was one Ray had seen before, the panicked calculation of someone realizing they'd been caught. Ray slowed to a stop about 10 feet from the man, positioning himself between him and the girl. He stood tall, shoulders squared, hands loose at his sides but ready to move. He didn't have a weapon, but he had training and size on his side. "Back away from her," Ray commanded, his voice steady. "Police are already on their way." The girl had stopped running and stood frozen, breathing hard, tears streaming down her face. Ray could hear the faint wail of sirens in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. The man took a step backward, eyes darting from Ray to the road and back again. "This isn't your business," he snarled. "This is a family matter." "She used the signal," Ray replied simply. "That made it my business." The standoff stretched between them, tension thick in the air. Ray knew the next few moments would determine everything. Help was coming, but it wasn't here yet. Until then, he was the only thing standing between this girl and whatever horrible fate had been planned for her. Tiana's heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat. Everything had happened so fast. 1 minute she was trapped in that car, and now she was standing in an open field, watching her mother's boyfriend face off with the man from the green car. The man who had seen her signal. The man who had followed them. "Just go back to your car," her mother's boyfriend shouted, his face twisted with anger. "This doesn't concern you." The Marine didn't budge. He stood like a wall between them, solid and unmovable. "The police are almost here," he said calmly. "You should think about what you're doing." Tiana took a few shaky steps backward. Her cheeks stung where she'd been hit during their struggle in the car. It had all happened so quickly, his hand grabbing her wrist when she tried to reach for the door lock, her desperate lunge for the steering wheel, the car swerving wildly as they fought for control. She could still hear his words, cold and frightening. "You think you're so smart with your little hand signals? Nobody's coming to help you. By tonight, you'll be 2 states away where nobody can find you." The memory made her shudder. What would have happened if the Marine hadn't followed them? If she hadn't remembered that hand signal from the video? Her mother's boyfriend suddenly lunged toward her, trying to circle around the Marine. "Come here, girl. We're leaving." The Marine moved quickly, blocking his path. "I said stay back." His voice was quiet but firm, the kind of voice that expected to be obeyed. For a moment, no one moved. Tiana could hear birds calling in the distance, the faint sound of traffic on the highway, and the growing wail of police sirens. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to stop shaking. "Look, man," her mother's boyfriend said, his tone suddenly changing, trying to sound reasonable. "This is just a misunderstanding. The girl's my girlfriend's daughter. We had an argument, that's all. You know how teenagers are." The Marine's expression didn't change. "Then you won't mind explaining that to the police." Her mother's boyfriend's face hardened again. His eyes darted toward the road, then back to Tiana. She could almost see him calculating, wondering if he could grab her and get back to the car before the Marine stopped him. "Don't even think about it," the Marine warned, reading his intentions. The standoff stretched for what felt like forever. Tiana's legs trembled, wanting to run but afraid to move. The sirens were getting louder now, maybe just a minute or 2 away. Suddenly, her mother's boyfriend made his decision. Instead of coming toward her again, he turned and sprinted back toward the car. The Marine didn't chase him. Instead, he backed up, staying between Tiana and the fleeing man. "Are you hurt?" he asked her, his eyes still watching the man running across the field. Tiana touched her cheek where it stung. "Not bad," she managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm Ray," the Marine said gently. "I saw your signal at the traffic light. The police are almost here. You're safe now." Safe. The word felt strange after hours of growing terror. Tiana watched as her mother's boyfriend reached the car and yanked open the door. For a horrible moment, she thought he might have a gun, might come back and try to shoot them both. Instead, he jumped into the driver's seat. The car's engine roared to life. Tires spun in the gravel as he tried to pull back onto the road and escape. But it was too late. A police cruiser came into view, lights flashing, followed by a second. They pulled across the road, blocking the blue sedan's escape. Tiana watched as officers jumped out, weapons drawn, shouting commands. "It's over," Ray said quietly. "They've got him." Tiana finally let herself cry then, not from fear but from relief. The tears came in a flood, washing away some of the tension she'd been holding. Ray kept a respectful distance, but stayed close enough that she felt protected. "I didn't think anyone would help," she said between sobs. "I didn't think anyone would see." "I saw you," Ray answered simply, "and I'm glad I did." In the distance, the officers were handcuffing her mother's boyfriend, putting him in the back of a police car. Another officer was walking toward them across the field, radio in hand. Soon there would be questions, statements, phone calls to her mother. But for now, Tiana just stood there, breathing in the open air, free from the car that had felt like a prison just minutes before. The next few hours passed in a blur for Tiana. The police officers were kind but thorough, asking question after question as they sat in the back of an ambulance. A female officer named Officer Chen stayed by her side the whole time, gently helping her through the toughest parts of her statement. "You're doing great," Officer Chen assured her, passing her a bottle of water. "I know this is hard, but everything you tell us helps build the case against him." Tiana nodded, taking small sips. Her throat felt dry from all the talking. "What about my mom? Has anyone called her?" "Yes, she's on her way," Officer Chen said. "She should be here soon." Across the road, Tiana could see Ray talking with two other officers. He stood tall, gesturing occasionally as he explained what had happened. Even from a distance, there was something steady about him, like a tree with deep roots. Tiana couldn't help wondering what might have happened if he hadn't been at that traffic light, if he hadn't recognized her signal, if he hadn't cared enough to follow. A paramedic gently cleaned the small cut on her cheek, putting a bandage over it. "This won't need stitches," she said with a smile. "But you might have a bruise for a few days." Tiana nodded, barely hearing the words. Her mind was stuck on something her mother's boyfriend had said in the car. "By tonight, you'll be 2 states away where nobody can find you." What had he meant? Where had he been taking her? Officer Chen must have noticed her expression. "What are you thinking about?" she asked gently. "He said he was taking me far away," Tiana replied quietly. "That no one would find me." "I don't think he was just taking me somewhere to scare me. I think—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Officer Chen's face grew serious. "We found some things in his car that suggest you're right. His phone has messages to people in another state. This wasn't just about scaring you." A chill ran through Tiana despite the warm day. "Human trafficking," she whispered, the words barely audible. She'd learned about it in school last year, how young girls disappeared, how they were sold and exploited. She'd never imagined it could happen to her. "We're looking into that possibility," Officer Chen confirmed. "The important thing is that you're safe now. You did something incredibly brave with that hand signal. You saved yourself." Just then, a police car pulled up, and Tiana's mother jumped out before it had fully stopped. Her face was streaked with tears, her hair a mess, as if she'd run out of the house the moment she got the call. "Tiana," she cried, rushing toward the ambulance. Tiana stood up shakily, and her mother wrapped her in a tight hug, sobbing against her shoulder. "I'm so sorry," she kept saying. "I'm so sorry. I had no idea. I never thought he would. I never knew he was." Tiana hugged her back, her own tears starting again. She felt a complicated mix of emotions, relief at being safe, lingering fear from what had almost happened, and even a strange sense of pride that she had remembered the signal, that she had fought back. As her mother held her, Tiana looked over her shoulder and saw Ray watching them from a distance. He gave her a small nod of acknowledgement. She wanted to thank him, to tell him what his actions meant to her, but words seemed too small for that. Officer Chen approached them gently. "Mrs. Washington, we'll need to ask you some questions as well. At first, there's someone I think you both should meet properly." She gestured toward Ray, who was now walking toward them. "This is Staff Sergeant Ray Wilson," Officer Chen introduced him. "He's the Marine who saw your daughter's distress signal and followed the vehicle." Tiana's mother turned to him, still keeping one arm around her daughter. Her eyes were filled with tears and gratitude. "You saved my baby," she said, her voice breaking. Ray shook his head slightly. "Your daughter saved herself. She's the brave one. She knew what to do in a terrible situation, and she had the courage to do it." For the first time since the nightmare began, Tiana felt something like strength returning. Maybe Ray was right. Maybe she had saved herself. But she also knew that without him seeing her signal, without him caring enough to act, this story might have had a very different ending. 2 weeks later, Tiana sat nervously in a small waiting room at the police station. The walls were a dull beige, brightened only by a few posters about community safety programs. Her mom sat beside her, holding her hand tight. "You don't have to do this today if you're not ready," her mom said softly. "The detective said they have enough evidence without your testimony." Tiana shook her head. "I need to do this for me." The investigation had moved quickly after her rescue. When police searched her mother's boyfriend's phone, they found messages to people in 3 different states. They discovered he wasn't working alone, but was part of a larger network that trafficked young girls. Within days, police in multiple states had made arrests. The case was much bigger than anyone had initially thought. Detective Powell, a tall woman with kind eyes, opened the door. "We're ready for you, Tiana, if you still want to make your statement." Tiana stood up, smoothing down her shirt. These past 2 weeks had been hard. She'd had nightmares about being trapped in that car, about what might have happened if Ray hadn't been there. A counselor was helping her work through the fear, teaching her that her brain was still processing the danger she'd been in. The counselor called it trauma, but also said Tiana was showing remarkable strength. "I'll be right outside," her mom assured her, giving her hand one last squeeze. The room where they took her statement was simple, just a table, some chairs, and a camera in the corner. Detective Powell explained they were recording so Tiana wouldn't have to tell her story multiple times. "Take your time," the detective said. "Just tell us everything you remember in your own words." Tiana took a deep breath and began talking. She described how her mother's boyfriend had picked her up from school, how he'd taken her in the wrong direction, how she'd felt a growing sense that something was terribly wrong. Her voice grew stronger as she continued, describing the moment she remembered the hand signal and how she used it when she saw Ray at the traffic light. "I wasn't sure if he'd understand what it meant," she explained. "It was just this thing I saw on social media, but I didn't know if other people knew about it." "That signal has been saving lives," Detective Powell told her. "You're the 3rd person in our county alone who's used it successfully this year." When Tiana finished her statement, Detective Powell thanked her. "What you've told us today, combined with the evidence we've gathered, will help make sure these people can't hurt anyone else." As they left the interview room, Tiana was surprised to see Ray standing in the hallway, talking with another officer. He was in his uniform today, looking official and somehow different from the man who had stood between her and danger in that field. "Staff Sergeant Wilson wanted to check in on the case," Detective Powell explained. "He's been helping us connect with military resources to track some of the suspects with military backgrounds." Ray smiled when he saw Tiana. "How are you doing?" he asked simply. "Better," she replied, and it was true. Each day was a little easier than the one before. "They told me you gave your statement today," Ray said. "That takes courage." Tiana's mom joined them, shaking Ray's hand warmly. "We can never thank you enough." "Actually," Ray said, looking slightly uncomfortable with the praise, "I wanted to tell you both something. That training where I learned about the hand signal, it only happened because of survivors speaking out, people like Tiana who were brave enough to tell their stories." He turned to Tiana. "The officer who conducted our training said something I won't forget. He said these signals only work if people learn them, recognize them, and then have the courage to act. It's a chain that only works if every link holds." Tiana thought about that, how her remembering the signal had led to Ray recognizing it, which led to him following them, which led to her escape and now to multiple arrests. A chain of actions that had not only saved her but might save others too. The hand signal video has over 10 million new views since your story hit the news, Detective Powell added. Even without showing your face or using your name, your story is making a difference. For the first time since everything happened, Tiana felt something beyond just relief at being safe. She felt like maybe somehow something good could come from something so terrible. And that feeling, small as it was, gave her hope. 6 months later, Tiana stood backstage at her high school auditorium, taking deep breaths to calm her nerves. Through the curtain, she could hear the principal introducing the special assembly on personal safety. "You got this," her friend Zoe whispered, giving her shoulder a squeeze, "just like we practiced." Tiana nodded, smoothing down the front of her blue blouse. It had been her idea to organize this assembly after everything that happened. Her counselor had suggested that finding a way to help others might be healing for her too. She'd been right. The principal's voice grew louder as she approached the end of her introduction. "And now, please welcome a student who has turned her own experience into a mission to help others stay safe." Tiana walked onto the stage, blinking against the bright lights. The audience seemed huge, the entire student body plus teachers and some parents. In the back row, she spotted her mom sitting next to Ray, who had taken time off from his military duties to be here. He gave her a small nod of encouragement. "Hi everyone," Tiana began, her voice shaking slightly before finding its strength. 6 months ago, I was in a dangerous situation that could have ended very badly. I was nearly a victim of human trafficking." She paused as a murmur went through the crowd. This wasn't just a story on the news anymore, it was happening to someone they knew, someone just like them. "The thing that saved me was a simple hand gesture I saw on a social media video." Tiana demonstrated the signal, palm up, thumb tucked in, fingers folded down. This signal was created so people could silently ask for help during video calls if they were with someone dangerous. But it works anywhere, in cars, stores, on the street. She went on to explain how a Marine had recognized her signal and followed the car, how police had made arrests, and how the investigation had uncovered a trafficking network operating in 3 states. 15 people have been arrested, she said, and at least 7 other potential victims have been identified and helped to safety. As she spoke, her confidence grew. This wasn't just her trauma anymore, it was a story that could help others. "After my experience, I learned that many trafficking victims are targeted by people they know. It's not always strangers. Often it's boyfriends, family friends, even relatives." She paused to let that sink in. That's why it's so important to know the warning signs and have a safety plan. For the next 10 minutes, Tiana and Zoe demonstrated various safety strategies they'd researched. They talked about the importance of telling someone where you're going, checking in with friends, and trusting your instincts when something feels wrong. "The hand signal is just one tool," Tiana explained. "What's most important is looking out for each other." When they finished their presentation, the principal returned to the stage with a special announcement. "Thanks to Tiana's efforts, our school board has approved adding safety training to our health curriculum, including recognition of the universal distress signal." The applause was so loud it seemed to shake the floor. Students stood up, clapping and cheering. Some kids Tiana barely knew gave her thumbs up or nodded with new respect. She felt tears prick her eyes, but these were different from the tears she'd cried in the months before. These felt like release, like closure. After the assembly, Ray made his way through the crowd to find her. "That was something special," he said, his usual serious expression softened with pride. "You took what happened and turned it into something that will help others. That's real courage." Tiana smiled, feeling stronger than she had in months. "I had a good example to follow." Her mum joined them, wrapping an arm around Tiana's shoulders. "The principal says 3 other schools have already asked if you do this presentation for their students." Tiana considered this. 6 months ago, she'd been a girl trapped in a car, desperate and afraid. Now she was standing here, surrounded by people who cared about her, having just taught hundreds of her peers something that might one day save their lives. "Yes," she said, feeling certain. "I'd like that." As they walked out of the auditorium together, Tiana realized something important. Her story hadn't ended that day by the side of the road. In many ways, it was just beginning. And this new chapter, the one she was writing herself, might end up helping more people than she could ever imagine.